Kermit's presentation was one of the best he's done. We have it on video. Ron and Steve got it. And so we'll see how it goes. And now, Bill.
There's a little feedback there. So this presentation has about 3 different titles. As you can see on the PowerPoint there, Can God Keep a Promise? Is one of the titles. And that's going to be connected with, he made a promise of giving land to people. Can he keep that promise? And another aspect of that promise is I want to have everybody understand that the promised land, both that promised to Israel, and I think, which that serves as a paradigm or a sample of, for the earth, the meek shall inherit the earth. That land that God promises to people is not a desert. And I'd like to make that point. Living in the land of Israel, I lived there for 34 years, as Joe said, and I was very interested in Bible geography. And I think there's some significant truths that we can understand from the land, that the land itself is, I got to turn on, yeah. Sure, sorry about that. Red means stop, green means go, huh? There, that's green. Got the typical male color blindness. So if you didn't hear me before out the microphone, I think that the promised land that God promised to his covenant people, Israel, serves as a paradigm for the land which he promises to give to his covenant people, made through Jesus the Messiah. As Jesus himself said, the meek will inherit the earth. So it's important to understand that the land that God promised to give to his people is not a desert. Because for some reason, people that haven't visited the land of Israel, and even for some that have, depends on where you go and what time of the year, you can think that the land, it's presented as a desert. In all the movies, Mary is riding a donkey through a barren, sandy or rocky desert, kind of like outside the walls here. But now the presentation of the land of Israel looks a little bit like always what Phoenix looks like. We do have areas that look like this in the land of Israel. But the best way to understand or to describe the land of promise is not that it's a desert, but that there's very much variety. And that variety is a package, I think, that the Lord is saying, in the age to come, there's going to be a lot of variety. It's a good land. The Bible describes the land that God gave to Israel as a good land, a land in which they would lack nothing. So, the other title for this little presentation was Bible Geography and You. So there are a couple of main truths that I think that the land still tells us. The land can be a testimony. Just like I believe the people of Israel, God had a role for them to be witnesses, to testify to who God is, so the land as well testifies to who he is and to the veracity of his word. I think there's a little bit of a feedback on this yet, isn't there? Okay. A promise of God to give land to a people, the promised land. And you can see that picture right there. It doesn't look like a desert. So I like to show people pictures of the land of Israel that are not desert, because there's a lot of terrain that isn't a desert. This is the area in the northern side, the Hula Valley looking up to Mount Hermon with a little bit of snow on it. My guess is, has anybody ever been to Israel? Okay, so depends on what time of the year you've been there, but most people don't think that that's what Israel looks like, that picture right there. I'm going to show you a few more of those. Before we get to how the land looks, note this interesting language connection. The Hebrew word for man is Adam, or in Hebrew we'd say Adam. Adam. And in Hebrew, the meaning of the word is built on 3 consonant letters. The word Adam, is exactly the same word for land or ground, just making the word ground effeminate of Adam. So we are connected. Man, humanity, and of course, both male and female are Adam, right? God created man, Adam, humanity. Male and female, he created them. So when you say the word Adam, it includes both genders. We are the same, in the Hebrew mind, we're from the ground. God made us from the ground. We're related to the ground. This is our place. This is the place Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh intended us to be, is on the land, on the ground. And we're connected. And you can see that idea runs like a thread through the Bible, where God made man. He put him in a garden, land. He gave him land. And he would tend that land, and the land would produce. And that idea runs right through the Bible as a thread. His covenant people, Israel. He gave them land. If they're in the right relationship with him, they would stay in the land and be blessed in the land. If not, they would be removed from the land and perish. In the book of Revelation, those who are members of the covenant community of God, the new heavens and the new earth. We see that theme in the New Testament, that God's covenant people are to inherit land. Okay? So, he made a promise. To whom did God make a promise of land? To his people Israel, Abram's descendants. This is another picture. Doesn't look like a desert, right? This is a real biblical location. It's Hatzor. I put the name up there. I guess I didn't. You can see the picture, and there's ruins there. Archaeologists can go and find the remnants of these ancient biblical cities. Tens, hundreds of real places that are mentioned in the Bible. Archaeologists go and find the remnants of them. Hatzor or Hazor was the place that Israel conquered under Joshua. It was one of the 3 cities that they burned. The Canaanites' temples and so forth were destroyed. Now, this is another point I'd like to make. The land of Israel is a real place. A couple people have been there. When you read the Bible, you're not reading The Lord of the Rings, where Bilbo Baggins is going to the land of Mordor. I know that Mordor doesn't really exist. So it's a fiction. It's a story. The Bible presents a different story. The Bible is saying, this is a real place. These places that I'm describing, the narrators are describing in the Bible, they're telling us they're real places. And you know what? They are. Like I say, there's hundreds of places. The Bible is very, very exact geographically. And you can go and find their ruins now. But they're there. It's a real place. So that was one of the reasons that got me interested in going to the land of Israel. I wanted to see, is it real? Is this real? Or is this just a Lord of the Rings fantasy? See, if we couldn't go and visit Capernaum and Chorazim and Beth-shemesh and Lachish and Ajalon and Megiddo and right on down the line, all these places that I mentioned in the Bible, that would suggest that this is a fiction, right? But you can go and visit these places, which is a suggestion. It's saying that this is real history that happened to real people, real places on our earth. That's why I put this little map here, right? You can get in an airplane and fly there in less than a day. We could all be in the land of Israel. Well, maybe with the COVID test now it might take us a little bit longer, but basically you can get on an airplane and be within 24 hours in the land of the Bible. It's on our earth. It's a real place. Okay, so God makes a promise. He says, Abram, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh said to Abram, go from your country, from your kindred, from your father's house, to the land that I will show you. It's interesting in Hebrew, it's actually lech lecha. It's really go from yourself, even, the first command. And I think there is a sense in which we are denying ourselves. To really come into the blessing of God, you have to do that. Your family, your kindred, normal things. So God said, go from a land, and he's in Mesopotamia, we won't argue with that. He leaves Mesopotamia, and he comes to a place called Shechem, in the land of Canaan, was called Canaan at the time. And these are real places where Abraham first was promised the land. Actually, God said, to your descendants, I will give this land. And it's between two mountains, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, which will later come into history as well. See, it's not a coincidence that the very first place that God, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, promised to Abram that his descendants would inherit the land, hundreds of years later, his descendants came into the land as a people group. They had multiplied. And it's like the first place they went to, like a beeline, after they conquered Jericho and Ai, right to Shechem, right to the very same place where God made that promise to Abram. Why? They're acknowledging that the promise you made, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, has come true. It happened. You gave land to Abram's descendants. And even though it took hundreds of years, passage of time, which I'm sure caused many people to say, it's a bunch of baloney. Joel, thank you. This is just a fictitious idea of somebody. Hundreds of years can pass, and so you wonder if God's promise will come to be. Well, they went there, and they stood, some on the foot of Mount Ebal, some on the foot of Mount Gerizim, and said, we acknowledge Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh as our God. He's done what he said he would do. So it's a real place. Okay, lots of other biblical locations. Here's another site of the same location. Here you can see the quotation from Genesis 12:7. To your offspring I will give this land. This is a theme. God is promising to human beings, Adam, descendants of Adam, land. I mentioned 400 years past. Did it come to be? Did God make good on his promise? Even though, I'll guarantee you, there are many people among the Jews themselves, but for sure among non-Jewish people, maybe they heard about this idea that Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh had promised land to Abram's descendants. But as those years passed, people would doubt it. The passage of time causes doubt. But think about this for a second. Once it happened, 400 years, I think it's 400 years from the time that God made that first promise to Abram. Once it happened, the grandeur of God is all the more known because he could keep that promise after hundreds of years. All right? What caused the people to doubt, some people to doubt, the passage of time, actually brought out even more so the transcendence of God. People were in Egypt, and now they're coming in, they leave the land. And look at the description of the land of Canaan that God had promised to his descendants. A couple of different places. This is Joshua and Caleb's description. Remember, the 12 spies went out, one representing each tribe. They all come back. 10 give a bad report. They give dibat ta'aretz. That's the last phrase down there. Oh, it didn't come through in Hebrew. They kind of cut down the land, is what it was. And I think there's a little bit of that in Trinitarianism today. Because you have the idea in modern Christian theology that I'm going to leave this earth. This is not my home. I'm going to heaven. That's a little bit poking your finger in God's eye and saying, I don't really like this. But I know I as a Trinitarian, I was mixed about that because I know the beauty of the land. I know the beauty of this earth, the waterfalls, the mountains, the oceans, the provision, the bounty year after year. I know this is a beautiful place. So I'm thinking, wow, it's a beautiful place, but I'm going somewhere else. I'm going to go disembodied somewhere else. But that idea is a bit of a dibat ha'aretz. It's speaking evil of the land, the promise that God had made for us, to want to leave here and escape. Caleb, they come back and say, the land which we passed through to spy it out is an exceedingly good land. Now, if the land was a desert, you think they would have said that? That it's an exceedingly good land? No. The truth is, the nature of the land of Israel, it's not a desert. It has a lot of variety. And see that map up there? The heartland of the land of Israel, it's only 150 miles long by 45 miles wide. Yet within that small area, there are tens, fair to say, of different geographical regions. They're small little pockets of area, one next to the other, that are very different. It's a little bit like California, if you've ever been to California, squeezed down into 150 miles by 45 miles. All the variety of California, right? California is the #1 grower of grapes and almonds and, I don't know, maybe watermelons, and everything seems like it's all from California in the valley. Well, Israel is like that. It has all that potential, but it's all into a very small land. And that's one of the reasons, like a person like me, my wife, and my boys, we still like to live there, because you have all that at your fingertips. You can go snorkeling in Elah, or you can go snow skiing on Mount Hermon. And it's all, or the Mediterranean Sea. It's all right there within an hour, hour and a half. Elah, you have to take a little bit more time than that. So it's variety. And another thing that's different for most Americans, although people in Arizona can understand this a little bit better, is in Israel it only rains for 5 months out of the year, maybe 6, half of the year. So half of the year it doesn't rain. That means you're dependent on other water sources. And therefore the land, the wheat and so forth, the land that is used to grow crops, it looks dry at the end of the dry season. But then it'll be very green again during the time of the rainy season. Look at another description of the promised land. Right? Do you really think God's going to promise to give his people a desert? He doesn't. The promised land is not a desert. The book of Deuteronomy, as the Israelites are getting close to coming into the promised land, the second generation, Moses, speaking God's words, says, "For Yahweh your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks, of water, of fountains and springs, flowing out in the valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines, fig trees, pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land in which you will eat bread without scarcity, a land in which you will lack nothing." Now that kind of sounds like the age to come. A land in which you will lack nothing. It's the good land. For the Lord your God, the last sentence there, bringing you into, you have to thank the Lord your God for the good land he's bringing you into. Now, here's a few more pictures of this good land. This is where the Jordan River comes into the Sea of Galilee. Doesn't look like a desert. That's probably the city of Bethsaida, buried there. Okay, they're excavating it right now. One of the 3 cities where Jesus did most of his mighty works. Just under that clump of trees, now the stuff gets covered up after centuries with dirt and brush, and the archaeologists go in there and uncover it. This is probably Bethsaida. And here's the hill country of Judah, just 10 miles west of Jerusalem. The town there on one of those hills, it's called Kiryat Ye'arim, the village of the forests. There's forests in the land of Israel. Like in Flagstaff, you go up to Flagstaff, it's different than here. That's the feeling you have in Israel. But you can get that feeling in a 20-minute drive, not a 2-hour, how long does it take to get to Flagstaff? A little more, okay? All right? So in Israel, you can change those regions just like that. Mediterranean, coastal plain, mountains, Dead Sea, all within half an hour's drive of each other. So here's the village of the forest, 10 minutes west of Jerusalem. Here's my lovely wife. In the springtime, the flowers come out, pine trees, oaks, etc. This is just near Jerusalem, only 10 miles away. It's called the foothills. This is Beth-shemesh, where the Ark of the Covenant came from Philistia. And the people there didn't treat it properly. Okay? It's a real city, and the archaeologists have uncovered parts of it. This is toward the end of the dry season. You still have the trees, but look in the valleys in between. It's drier where the wheat was. This is the valley of Elah, Azekah, and the valley of Elah. This is where David fought Goliath, in the little valley there, a little bit kind of right middle part of the picture. But it's not a desert. Here's another picture of it in the springtime. This is Socoh, where the Philistines were encamped on one side of the valley, the Israelites on the other side. The sites are mentioned in the Old Testament narrative. And here's Gath, the home of Goliath, of the Philistines. Out on the coast, toward the Mediterranean Sea, it's flat, but it's only a stone's throw away from the hills. And it's a completely different kind of region and different kinds of people living there. You can see it's not a desert. The coast is relatively agriculturally productive. Here's the Mediterranean. And the border of the Promised Land, the easiest one to define is the west. God says the Mediterranean Sea, that's your western border. The other ones are a little harder sometimes. You got to go point to point, like the dot to dot. But the west, to the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, the sea is another word for Gentiles. Islands is another word for Gentiles. Out there, to the west, it's foreign. It's not their land, and they knew it. They knew that's the border. And the coast of Israel is a straight edge. Joppa is the biggest port. It's that little thing right there. It's not, the land of Israel, the land that God gave to the Jews, was not conducive for seafaring. They had to go to the neighbors in the north, to the Phoenicians, to get ships in the Mediterranean and so forth. For the Israelites, this is a border. Jonah was here in Joppa. Peter came to here in Joppa. Simon Bar Jonah. Very interesting that the one place in the Old Testament where Joppa is mentioned is in the case with Jonah. And then the one place in the main one in the New Testament is where the son of Jonah, Peter, comes to. And that's where he sees a vision of sheets coming down, and the Lord is preparing him to bring the message to a Gentile. A little further up the coast, Mount Carmel also juts into the Mediterranean Sea. Does it look like a desert? See, it's a good land. It's got a lot of variety. Mediterranean Sea, who doesn't like to go to the beach and all of the climate that's associated with it? This is why my kids, a couple of them are still there, and my two younger kids even want to go back there. It's a good land. Here's the Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, and some of the kind of a mountainous edge on the western side of it. Magdala, where Mary Magdalene is from, was in that picture. Here's the wheat fields in the Galilee. It's not a desert. Here's the Sea of Galilee, the north side. This is the town, the ruins of Capernaum, which was Jesus' hometown during his public ministry on the north side of the Sea of Galilee. On the north side of the Sea of Galilee is where most of the mighty works of Jesus were done. Between the cities of Capernaum, this one, see there's ruins there. Archaeologists dig up some ruins from the Roman period, the Byzantine period, and some below that into the earlier Roman, probably 1st century AD. Waterfalls. The Golan Heights coming down from Mount Hermon. Here's Mount Hermon, 9,000 feet, a little snow on the top. This is Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus went with the apostles and he asked, "Who do people say that I am?" And the apostles said, "Well, people think various. One of the prophets, Jeremiah, maybe. Herod Antipas thinks you're John the Baptist, raised from the dead." And then Jesus asked them, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter said, "You're the Mashiach, the Christ." Okay, that's in the district of Caesarea Philippi, up here, probably quite close to Mount Hermon. And then we do have deserts, because you have the rain shadow, the mountainous ridge going north-south, parallel with the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean brings in the rain, drops down the water, mostly on the west side. You drop down to the Dead Sea, there's not as much rain in the Dead Sea. So Jerusalem gets 22 inches of rain every year. Jericho, about 13 miles as the crow flies, gets 4 inches of rain. They're only 20 miles away from each other, but a totally different kind of climate. So it's variety. So we have deserts. In the south as well, the deserts are not sandy in the land of Israel. They're rocky deserts, kind of like the area here in the Phoenix vicinity. And then, of course, Jerusalem. It's a real place. And God has, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, says, "In this place, my name will be known." And Dr. Joe's latest figure, I'm going to remember, 77 times the Bible records, "And you will know that I, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, am God." And I think it's by his work in that city, among other of perhaps the most important work that he's done in that city, is that he raised Jesus from the dead. He broke the power of sin and death in that city. Jerusalem, there is no reason, humanly speaking, why Jerusalem should be significant. Absolutely no reason. It's a hill country city, has a little spring of water coming out of the ground. It's kind of on the way to nowhere. There are some geographical there are some important aspects to it, but it's all local. There's no reason it should be important internationally. But God said, watch, I'll take that place and I'm going to make it important. The resurrection of the Messiah from the dead is among those ways in which we can know that Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh is God. So, all that to sum up, God made good on his promise of giving a good land to Abraham's descendants. In the book of Joshua, it's recorded, thus Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers. They took possession of it, and they settled there. Not one word of all the good promises that Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. This is what the Bible is telling us. Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, what he says, he will do. And especially in this way or realm of giving land to his people. The word for land in Hebrew is eretz. Joe had it on one of his slides. Eretz, everybody can say that. Eretz, eretz. But you need context to know if it means a specific piece of land or can also mean the whole earth. The eretz, at the beginning, God created the heavens and the eretz. You put it with the definite article, it changes the sound a little bit. Haaretz. Put the ha means the in front of it. So instead of eretz, it's aretz. But that's what God created in the beginning. The heavens and haaretz, the eretz, the land. So in context, land can be the whole earth or can be a specific part of the land. So God promised an eretz to Abram's descendants, but I believe it's a paradigm. It's a sample for another promise of land that he makes. It's a parallel. The promise and the fulfillment of God's giving land to Israel is a paradigm or a parallel to his promise of giving the earth to his covenant people in the kingdom of God with Jesus as the king. There's a promise of land again. The humble, Jesus said, took it from the Psalm 37. The humble shall inherit the earth. Okay, that's eretz. Land or earth. Which is it? It's both in a sense. But in context, I think here, it really means, it could mean you all of us have a piece of land that God promises to give. Inheritance. But corporately, for human beings, it's the earth. It was not to the angels that God gives the world to come, the writer of the book of Hebrews says. It's a little different word there for world. It means like the inhabited earth. But it's not to angels which God promised the world to come, of which we are speaking. It has been testified somewhere, what is man, that you are mindful of him, or the Son of Man, that you care for him, putting all things in subjection to him. The promise of the earth to mankind. And this is why it was very important for me to come to understand that Jesus is a real human being, that is at the right hand of God, who God says, I give you the earth as your inheritance. He's a human person. He's a human being. And Psalm 8 made so much more sense to me once I came to understand that it's really to a human being, not to a God-man or to another God, that God promised the earth, but to a human being. That elevates the status of human beings to really number 2 in the universe, above angels, as the book of Hebrews says. To what angel has God ever said, you are my son? He said it to a human being. He says it to Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus is our representative as a human being, greater than angels. Angels and authorities subject to him. According to God's promise, we are waiting for a new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. The new earth that we're waiting for, this earth is not going to be dissolved. I've heard popular Trinitarian pastors say that. They think this whole earth is just going to be dissolved, gone, like diffused, nuclear, in a nuclear way of some kind. But I don't think that's what the scriptures are saying. The new earth, biblically, means a renewed earth. It's a recreation. It's a regeneration. The Greeks wanted to escape. We believe, the Bible is saying, no, we are redeemable. The earth, creation, and us, humans, can be redeemed. So I look for redemption and not escape. That, I believe, is the biblical hope. And by the way, as we talk to Trinitarians and other Christians, I think this resonates with them a little bit. They know that there's something good about this earth. And to say we want to get away, really? Isn't it really about a man that was raised from the dead, who is flesh and bone, who we expect to return to this earth? That's our hope. That's our expectation, not a disembodied escape. We desire redemption, not escape. So God keeps his promises. As he gave the promised land to Abram's descendants, so we can be confident that he will give the promised earth to his covenant people that are made through Jesus. This is John chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. To all believe in his name, he gave the authority or the right to become children of God. It's a new covenant community. It's made through Jesus. The biblical hope is resurrection from the dead, not disembodied escape. As Jesus said, "Fear not, little flock. It is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." Here's an interesting little side point, I think. It's an important one. Say, what's in a name? The name of the Israelite who led the people of Israel into their promised land, he is Joshua, right? That is the way you say Jesus' name in Hebrew. Jesus' name really is Joshua. So I think there's another parallel. The one that brings us into the promised land is also a Joshua, just like in the Old Testament. By the way, when you think of Joshua, what's probably the main aspect of his life in the Old Testament, the Old Testament Joshua? What do we think of him for? What's he most famous for? Jericho. Yeah, conquest, I think somebody said. Jericho is a good example of that. Really, what he was involved with was leading the people in and removing the Canaanites. There's a purging that goes on before Israel comes into the land. Jesus is said to be in the New Testament the judge whom God has appointed. So I think there's as well a parallel there where he is the one who is purging that world in which righteousness dwells from iniquity. It's a neat parallel. The name of the one that brought Israel into the promised land is the same name as the one who brings us into the age to come. So just a couple points to wrap up. The land of the Bible is a real place. The Bible has very accurate geographical detail. It was my thing, right? I actually wrote a book about Bible geography, historical geography. So I was mixing in the academic world of Bible geography and archaeology and so forth. And in that world, there are people that deny the reality of the biblical record from a historical perspective. Because the history is no longer here. You can say, well, Abraham, he wasn't a real person. We don't have any other evidence of him being a real person. Or Joshua's not a real person. It's just some kind of a narrative that wants to teach us a moral or something like this. So you can deny the history. There are many archaeologists actually that deny the biblical record, historical record, from an archaeological perspective. It all depends on their presuppositions, how they want to interpret the evidence. Everybody will agree there's evidence for a Jericho destroyed, but they'll disagree on the date of its conquest. So some will say, well, no, that Canaanite city wasn't conquered in Joshua's time. It can't be Joshua. There would have been no Canaanites there. Others will say, no, there's actually good evidence that there was a Canaanite city destroyed in Jericho in Joshua's time. But there are archaeologists that deny the historical narrative as they interpret the archaeology. But I did not run across one Bible geographer scholar that denied the record from the geographical perspective. Everybody, all these scholars, they know that the Bible got the geography really correct. Detailed correctness. So whenever you read it and you're not really sure about, what's going on with that geography, I knew, as they knew, that the problem wasn't in the record, the problem was here, with our understanding. Now that's not to say some people in later history, usually it's the Christian ones, that messed up some of the geographical terms in the scripture. But by large, everybody sees that this geography is really, really accurate, which is an evidence that we're talking about real history. Very detailed geographically. And that geography, we can go out and see it today. I really think the land of Israel is a testimony today. It testifies. Just like the existence of the Jews today testifies that Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh is the true God, the God of the Scriptures, even though they're in an incorrect relationship in the majority. The land still testifies. You can go there and see, what that narrative is talking about. It's there in that book. Second point, the Promised Land is not a desert, but has much geographical variety. The gift of land to God's covenant people, Israel, serves as a paradigm of his gift of land to his covenant people made through Jesus. It's a neat parallel, right? It really is. God gave land to his covenant people, happened. We can be confident that Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh can do what he says he will do, even if it takes hundreds of years, thousands of years. That's the last point. Thank you. Comments or questions? Kermit, did I see a...
So, Bill, you're saying that the geography in the Old Testament is so good that it must indicate that the history of Israel in the Old Testament is true, or a lot of it is.
Yes, it's very exact. Some border descriptions in the book of Joshua are a good example. They can argue about when they were written, but somebody wrote it in the land of Israel because they know the sites. They had to be there. It goes, for instance, I'll give you an example. The border between Judah and Benjamin. Right? Jerusalem just barely sits on the edge of Benjamin. In the border description in the book of Joshua, two places, Joshua chapter 15 and Joshua chapter 18, between Benjamin and Judah. It's very specific. It comes to the spring of Rogel and goes along the shoulder of the Jebusites, up along the shoulder of the valley of Hinnom. And then from there to the waters of Niphtoah, to the cities on Mount Ephron, to Kiryat Jearim, to Mount Seir, crosses over to Kesalon, goes down to Beth-shemesh, along the shoulder north of Timnah. So it's like, that sounds a little bit like a physician writing out his prescription or something, right? Because you're not familiar with the Hebrew as well. And it's like somebody that has studied medicine and knows it really well. So the Bible geographers, the people that were writing this history, they really, really know it. And it's accurate. You can go look at it and you can find every single one of those sites. There's a study to it, right? They didn't put signs saying here, this is Kiryat Jearim, the village of the forest. So there's an archaeological and a historical geographical method to locating these places. Archaeology is a big part of it. If you can dig and find some remnants in a place that fits up with those biblical descriptions, now you have a candidate. And maybe you get lucky and you find an inscription. Very rare, but there have been inscriptions found, for instance, at Gibeon, where Solomon had his dream, and he saw Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh in a dream. The altar was there at the high place of Gibeon, just a little bit northwest of Jerusalem, about 8 miles northwest of Jerusalem. So they found in the archaeological excavations there the name Givon, right? In Hebrew it's Gibeon. And Megiddo, found a piece of with Megiddo's name on it. And Bet-Shan, So every now and then you get lucky and you find an inscription. It's rare. But through the study, the methodology of locating these sites, wow, people just, you basically stand back and say, this is a detailed record. Whoever wrote it believed that there was a history going on here, real history.
And in Jericho, there is archaeological evidence that ancient Jericho really existed there?
Yeah, nobody argues that it didn't exist. What they argue over is the date of the conquest of the Canaanite city. All the archaeologists acknowledge that there was a Canaanite city there that came under a significant destruction. They argue about what the date of that destruction was. And I think there's really good evidence that it was destroyed at the time we believe Israel came into the land from the conservative reckoning, right? There's a difference in opinion on when Israel came into the land. But I take the conservative 1400 BC, right, date. There's good evidence of the destruction of the Canaanite city there that matches up with some of the details in the book of Joshua. For instance, the city was burned, and grain was preserved in jars, and then, I'm not sure the correct terminology, it's burnt, but it's still like petrified in a sense. That's probably not the right word. So the grain, evidences of the grain still in the jars. Whoever conquered that city didn't take the spoils, right? Like it's described in the book of Joshua. And then there was an abandonment of the city. That area, that Canaanite city got covered up. And for the walls too. There's good evidence that you have a Canaanite stone wall on the bottom of the fortification with a mud brick superstructure, you'd call it. The top part of the wall was mud brick. That fell down beneath itself, like the Hebrew says. Okay, it's a matching of the biblical account. So it's a question more of arguing over the date of the destruction of that Canaanite city. And if you want to pursue that particular one, there's an organization called Associates of Biblical Research that have analyzed the dig, the pottery. Pottery is very important in archaeological excavation because it's stuff that lasted. And you have a way in which you can get a relative dating. Just like they didn't have this 50 years ago, this microphone. I don't know, maybe they did, but not this particular brand. Okay, so if this thing somehow got buried and covered over, you could date by this style of microphone, get a relative dating for when this building was made. And that's the key for archaeological dating is pottery, because it was hard, it lasted a long time, and you can reconstruct it. Sometimes you find whole vessels, so you get an idea when these things were being used at any given period of time. Compare it with other places where maybe you got lucky and you found an inscription, so you can date that kind of style of pottery over here. Now you have the date over here. That's the way that things are dated. But I've found in the archaeological world, how an archaeologist interprets a location depends significantly on their presuppositions. They're going to find what they want to find or not find what they don't want to find. But others can come and analyze their reports. The archaeologists are fair in that way. They're reporting the styles and the shapes of the pottery. And they know that somebody else might interpret it differently than they do. And that's what the folks at Associates of Biblical Research have done. They've gone back and they've analyzed the excavation reports from the 1930s and 40s and 50s and 1960s at Jericho. And they say, you know what? This is excellent evidence of the destruction of the Canaanite city in around 1400 BC. Yep. Yeah.
I was curious about your Bible atlas, and is there a main thing that's different about it than other Bible atlases, or?
It's fair to say there is, and that is, it's called a satellite Bible atlas. So the base map, you give me the chance to make a commercial, huh? I don't know if you're doing that to be nice, if you're really curious, but the base map is a real picture, right, of the land of Israel taken by NASA, right? So that's the base map. I've touched it up here with colors because I kind of know. If you just take a dry satellite picture, some of the features don't come through like you'd want them to come through, so I touched it up here and there a little bit, and then put the graphic of the historical event on that map. I don't think there's any other. I was working with another guy who actually has a better base map than I used, but he hasn't published it. So I think this is the only one that so far has marked out the events on a satellite base map. So that can be very exact. That's what I liked that idea. You can get where these points are for a given site. Like here I'm looking at Sukkot and Azekah, Socoh and Azekah, where David and Goliath fought. That thing is sitting right on the ruin, right? Because you could zoom in enough and I could see, oh yeah, that's called a tel, a T-E-L. It's an accumulation of debris. That's what archaeologists go in and find these sites. So those site points are right on it. So that, I would say, yeah, it's a little bit different than that. It's kind of exact in that way. I'm not totally satisfied with the resolution I had on the maps because it's data from, I think, the 1980s. And now you can get higher resolution. Yeah.
Did you cover some of the kind of things in there in your writing that you went over with us in this session here?
Yeah, this is a historical geography from Abraham through to just a little bit after the time of Jesus. The book of Acts and a little bit of Jewish history into the 2nd century AD. So the main historical events from Abraham to Jesus, fair to say. Yeah. Now I wrote this when I was a Trinitarian, and it's interesting for me to go back now and read it, and I can see where, in that place, I'm already starting to think not like a Trinitarian. And then I'll read a few more pages down and say, oh man, I wouldn't say that today, you know? So that is a little bit of a, beware kind of thing, yeah. Okay, thanks for your attention. Oh, question.
Since we're in the Advent season, I was just curious what you could tell us about the inn where Jesus was born. It's called an inn, a cave, multiple things. What is your understanding?
Yeah, I think the birth narrative has come under some of that tradition accumulation that Joe and others have referred to earlier here today. In the particular case of where Jesus was born, first of all, they don't arrive on the night that Jesus was born, right? They get that wrong. They have them knocking on a door of an inn. Okay, that's, I think, an unfortunate translation by the King James. King James is a great translation. Those guys knew a lot. But they get a few things wrong. So it's not an inn. It's the same word that Luke, who's the writer in that case, he used for an upper room in his description of the Passover that Jesus had. So they had the Passover in he said, you'll find an upper room furnished, he told Peter, and there prepared the Passover. So it's this exact same word. So for whatever reason, the King James folks decided to translate this Greek word as an inn, where Luke uses the word for an inn in another place, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Remember, he brought him to an inn. Okay, so it's a different word. It's the word that Luke used in another location for an upper room. So they don't arrive at the same day. I believe they're there for weeks, probably months in Bethlehem already. And while they're there, the narrative in Luke says, while they're there, the time came for her to bear a child. Okay, so there's no midnight arrival. There's no fat innkeeper barring the entrance to his room. But you cannot wipe that away from people's minds now. I tried with my own kids. The place where we lived in a little village would put on they were believers in Jesus. And they would put the Christmas Story play on, the kids would. And one of the years, the kids all did it, production and everything. One year, my daughter was the organizer of it. And I said, don't have an innkeeper. There was no innkeeper, there's no inn. But I couldn't do it. It's too set into for whatever Christians like that story. But it's not in the Bible. But it goes back to the mistranslation. So I think they're in a home, and whatever it is, the circumstances of the birth, be it the humiliation of perhaps them having this child too early for them, the amount of time they've been married, or the messiness of birth, the privacy of the birth, whatever, they move from this guest room to somewhere else. Now, it doesn't even say where that somewhere else is. It just says, because there was no room for them in this guest room, he was put in a manger. Well, does that mean that they were in a stall? It doesn't say that. So there's no donkey mentioned in the New Testament nearby. There's no cow lowing, right? There's no other animals present when Jesus is born. Again, we look at what the New Testament says. So I think they're in a house. They're in a home. And they move the location for the birth itself. Now, did that answer your question? It kind of did. Yeah. There's no mention of a cave. That's tradition too.
So do you think they were out, like where the animals were, and there was a manger?
Hard to say, because you can move a manger, right? It can simply be a convenient place to put a child, and if the manger was wood, it's easy to move. However, here's another little thing to consider. Most the mangers in the land of Israel that I'm familiar with, that doesn't mean to say that they're the only kind. They're made of stone, right? You have a stone, you carve this cavity out of the stone, so you place water and hay and so forth in it. But that's not to say they couldn't make wooden mangers too. So you could move it. You could pick it up and move it to wherever they were. All that to say, the details of it aren't that clear. They're definitely not the way we have it presented in our time now, right? The wise men are not present at the same time as the shepherds, right? The wise men come later. The shepherds are in the fields, and that night, I think, or very soon thereafter, they come and see the child, but the wise men come later. They're not there together. So, I don't think I totally answered your question, but it's sort of a call to get back to the Bible and not just depend on the traditions again.
Tell us about tomorrow.
Okay, tomorrow. Well, before I say too much about it, I actually wanted to talk to you and Pastor Steve a little bit. Tomorrow, we have a panel in the first session with Joe and Kermit, and Steve is leading that. So I guess you're going to lead our discussion on what we're talking about. I think basically it's a focus on who the real Jesus is, the Christology. And then they've asked me to give a message during the church service, and I'm planning on speaking on John chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. Verse 5 says that the light shines in the darkness, and darkness has not overcome it. That's what that first section in the prologue of John leads up to. And right now is Hanukkah, okay, right? The Jewish celebration of Hanukkah. And the theme of Hanukkah is the light is still shining. I know I'll kind of compare that a little bit. But I want to give a little bit of a warning. And Joe and Pastor Steve can already say, no, do something different, Bill. I'm going to suggest a little different way to interpret the prologue of the Gospel of John than I think most biblical Unitarians have. My understanding is that that the Gospel of John in the prologue is already referring to the man Jesus Christ. This is the way the Socinian reformers, people call them the Socinians, this is the way they understood it. And that the beginning in the Gospel of John, while being a parallel or an allusion to the book of Genesis, is really about the new beginning which God is bringing about through and in Jesus Christ. So I know not everybody has this perspective. I've talked in another Church of God with this perspective, and then with the same idea that, okay, it's not going to be the way everybody has understood it, but I would only ask that people have a listen, consider it, and measure it with the scriptures. And I would love to have somebody say, no, that's not right there. I've studied this a lot, so I kind of have my ammunition ready, okay? I have a podcast called One God Report Podcast, and a majority of it has been on the Gospel of John, because, as we've mentioned, this is the place that Trinitarians like to find evidence for the deity of Jesus. And most of those in the Gospel of John have been in the prologue. So I've looked at this, so I kind of know what I'm going to say, right? I probably already can anticipate some questions and so forth. But if it's fair enough, I'd like to present this in the message, and I think it will resonate with people. I think you'll say, you know what, there could be something to that. Let me check it out a little bit more. All right, so that's kind of the plan for tomorrow. The first 5 verses of the Gospel of John.
Bill, why don't you close out with a little prayer?
Sure. Avinu Shebashamayim, our Father in heaven. We're grateful to be able to call you Father, to relate to you as our Father, that you care for us, and that you are concerned for us, and that you have good things planned, that you plan to give this earth, the kingdom, to human beings. And we know that so much, or entirely, depends on our Messiah, our Lord Jesus, and how you've exalted him and put him in the place at your right hand as your heir. We acknowledge that you've worked through him in this earth, on this land, and we look forward to the good things yet that you'll do through and in him on this earth. In his name, the name of Yeshua, Jesus, we pray and thank you. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.